Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a proud paid up member of the Wildlife Trust, and if you aren't, I strongly recommend it. It's a great organisation, and it's a great pleasure to be here to tell you about some bugs that I'm quite passionate about. I'll introduce you to this beautiful lady, which is the green peach aphid, or Myzus persicae. I say lady because you very rarely see a male aphid. They're almost all females, and they reproduce asexually, and they give birth to clones of themselves. Live young, they don't lay eggs. There's all sorts of interesting aspects of their biology that I'm going to touch on tonight. And she's also called the peach potato aphid. She's got lots of names, and you find her in all sorts of places. And I'm going to try and persuade you that they're really interesting. They're not just a pest in your garden. So I'm going to talk. I'm not just going to talk about aphids, though. I'm going to talk about their cousins, the other sap-sucking insects, the leafhoppers, the froghoppers, the spittlebugs, the sharpshooters. But I'll tell you. Let me see if I can make this progress. There we go. So I work at the John Innes Centre up the road. If any of you aren't familiar with it, we do fundamental science there. It's mostly plant biology, and we're trying to do the science that will help us make crops more sustainable and robust for the future and deal with some of the problems in agriculture. We're not really interested in that. We're really interested in how life works, and we use that as an excuse to get money to try and solve problems, but really we're just a bunch of biology nerds. And a lot of it is focused on wheat and other plants, tomatoes, which we do some interesting things to, like make them purple. We do a lot of work with this little weed called Arabidopsis, which is a cress, which is really easy to work with and understand, and we can translate those findings to other crops. And we do a lot of fundamental molecular biology and biochemistry and do fancy things to plants to make them light up and glow, and that tells us about how the genes are regulated and how they interact with each other. And we also do some work with microbes. We've got teams which are working on antibiotic producing microbes like streptomyces, and the John Innes Centre has got a very rich history of microbiology as well as plant biology. And we also do some work with insects, and especially plant-insect interactions. And this is generally where the insects are a problem and we need to solve it. And this includes our work with aphids, for the green peach aphid that I do a lot of work with, and other sap-sucking insects like the common meadow spittlebug, Philaenus fumarius, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And you probably know we're in Norwich. You don't need to be told that, but and Norwich is in that bit of England on the right, but I think you might know that. And I work as part of a team, Professor Saskia Hogenhout, FRS now as of last year, and I've been working in her team for the last coming up 15 years, and we work on the interactions of plants and their sap-sucking pests, like the aphid I've introduced you to, but others, including the spittlebug, the leafhoppers, and psyllids as well. And we're really interested. This is kind of a schematic representation of the science that we do, and all of these. Is this working as a pointer? Yeah, it's right. What these all have in common is that they're sap-sucking insects. They're not chewing away at leaves. They have these specialized mouth parts that act like straws, and they penetrate the surface of the plant and they navigate through until they find the veins which carry the nutrient-rich sap, and they suck it straight out. And this isn't to scale. Aphids are much bigger than this, and plant cells are smaller than this, but there are things they do when they're doing this that cause problems for the plant. They act, when a mosquito bites you, they inject you with painkillers and anticoagulants, which stop your body defending themselves against you and stop you feeling that. And aphids and other sapsuckers are also doing that to the plants. They are stopping the plant from sensing its attack and stopping the plant from defending itself. And I'll touch on a little bit about how they do that. But like mosquitoes, they also transmit diseases, and that's where they're a real problem. They're a great vector of viruses, And actually most plant viruses are spread by aphids. And that's where aphids are a real problem. It's not usually because of the damage they do to plants from the sap that they're sucking out. It's actually the diseases they spread, and that causes the bigger problems. As well as the sap-sucking insects, we also do some work on the diseases they transmit, not so much on the viruses, but on a group of bacterial plant pathogens. These are called phytoplasma. You can see some here under an electron microscope. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those later in the talk. So I'm going to talk, how long have I got? An hour? Less? So I'm going to talk mostly about the sap-sucking insects for the first half, then we'll have a break, and then I'll tell you a story about these phytoplasma, if there are any of you left. So this is a family tree of the insects, just to put these into context. Is there a switch? There's a switch here. Do you want to put the side lights on, or something like that? Yeah. I think now we're in the mood. So this is a family tree of the insects, which, as you probably know, are one of the most successful, evolutionary speaking, the most successful group of animals on the planet. Incredible adaptability, and they've been able to colonize every habitat on Earth, more or less. And some of the insects you've been more familiar with form part of this group, which are called the holometabolous insects. And that translates as complete metamorphosis, essentially. The flies, the butterflies and moths, the beetles, and the wasps, bees, and ants, these all have distinct larval forms, because, you know, flies have maggots, butterflies and moths have caterpillars, beetles have grubs, and bees, wasps, and ants have larvae, which metamorphosize into the adult form. And this group are distinct from other insects, which include the hemipterans, which means partial metamorphosis, which have nymphs, which are morphologically essentially the same as the adults. They shed their skin and they grow into slightly bigger versions of themselves. And this includes the aphids that I've already introduced, and they're very close relatives, the whitefly and the psyllids. I think this one's a psyllid. And aphids are quite diverse in their forms, and slightly more distantly related hoppers, they're generally called, which include the leaf hoppers and the plant hoppers. And if you've never heard of tree hoppers, then I recommend when you get home, you do a Google image search for tree hoppers, because these are the most incredible group of organisms, and they're all characterized by these very weird structures on their heads, which are very diverse. You have some guys who look like this, some like this, and a whole array of morphologically things. We've got a couple of species of these in the UK, which are quite drab and brown. They have got kind of lumps on their head, but you need to go to the tropics to find the most interesting ones. Not really sure why they have these structures. There's some recent work suggesting it might be about sensing disturbances in electric fields, so they can sense when predators are attacking them. But, you know, evolution does some weird things sometimes. And that's all I'm going to say about tree hoppers tonight, I'm afraid. I would love to give an hour talk on them, but I don't know very much about them. Cicadas as well, these are the largest of these groups of insects. You've probably heard them chirruping if you've been further south from the UK, very noisy. And also some blood-feeding insects live in this clade, which include the assassin bugs, and they're important vectors of some human diseases. Chagas disease and sleeping sickness are spread by hemipteran insects. So we think these blood feeders have actually evolved from sap-feeding herbivorous ancestors, but they've decided the animals look a little bit tastier. So all of these, the hemipterans, they all have these piercing, sucking mouth parts, whether they're going for sap or for blood. And they evolved, they separated, they had their last common ancestor with the major insect groups about 300 million years ago, which in contrast all mammals had their last common ancestor about 70 million years ago. So this is quite an ancient group of organisms. So aphids, I'm going to talk about in more detail first. You might be more familiar with this kind of view where your rose plant is one day suddenly covered in a sort of sticky mass of little bugs, and it looks pretty unappealing and it tends to annoy most people. And I do get people asking me, oh, I've got aphids on my roses, what should I do? And I give them very considered advice on how to keep the aphids alive and happy. You could put a porous plastic bag over the top, which will protect them from predators and parasitoids, but allow the gas exchange. Don't let them get too wet or the fungus will take over. And I don't tell them that that is to keep the aphids alive, but they're usually cotton on. And as I said, they feed from the plant sap. So if you look at a cross section of a leaf, in microscopic detail, it looks something like this, where you have the leaf surface with the epidermal cells, and inside all of the mesophyll cells, which is where the photosynthesis really happens. And the products of that photosynthesis are fed into the veins, where it's transported around the plant. That takes all of the sugars that are produced through photosynthesis and distributes it. And of course, that's where all the goodness is. So the aphids, and this is rather an old diagram, you can see this, how the aphid mouth parts make contact with the surface. And this structure here is actually it's called the rostrum. It's actually the case which holds the stylets, and the stylets are the mouth parts, which then extend out from that and penetrate. And they move very, very skillfully. It's not just a sort of stabbing motion. They're guided and they have muscles and they navigate between individual cells. So they don't penetrate the epidermal cells or the mesophyll cells. It moves in between them, which is an incredibly sophisticated movement, until it reaches the vein and it starts sucking the sap. In fact, they don't suck the sap out. I got called out on this by a reviewer of a paper we wrote recently, and we described them as sap-sucking insects. And the phloem sap, which carries the sugary, rich sap, is actually under positive pressure. So if you just stick a straw into it, then it exudes sap. So there's no need to apply a force to draw it out. So they're actually passively ingesting it, if I stand corrected. And there are actually two different types of vein in a plant. They have two circulatory systems. Unlike us, we just have the blood. They have the phloem sap, which carries the bounty, the fruits of the photosynthesis and all of the sugars and amino acids and the really valuable nutrients. And there's also the xylem sap, which is responsible mainly for bringing water and mineral nutrients up from the soil and distributing that around the plants. So the sugars are kind of being sent from the leaves down and around the plant. And so they're going in different directions and they have different roles. And this is, the xylem sap is generally devoid of nutritional value, whereas the phloem sap is absolutely packed full of it. And yet there are insects who look at this and think, well, no, I'm going to feed from the xylem. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of them later. It seems like an odd choice, but I think there are reasons for it. So how do we know all about this, about aphid feeding? And we've got some very weird scientists to thank for this, because one guy in particular called Freddie Chillingi, he came up with this idea of what he called the electropenetration graph. And he thought, what if we could measure the voltage between the plant and the aphid while it's feeding? And then we could characterize the feeding behavior. And what he did was exactly this. Here's a view of an aphid with an electrode glued to its back with silver glue, penetrating its mouth parts into the plant sap. And what we do is we stick one electrode onto the aphid and we put the other into the soil of the plant and measure the voltage across that whole system. And we get voltage readouts like this, which change as the feeding behavior develops. And Freddie actually figured out how to correlate these different waveforms with different processes that the aphid were going through. And he ultimately figured out that this is what's happening. And I can show you, I think, an experiment that was done in our lab. So this is a video of an aphid that our student Michael, he set up with an electrode glued to its back and recorded its the voltage. And as you can see at the moment, it's just like walking around looking for somewhere to feed. But I can probably fast forward this to, I think, about 2 minutes in. We get some nice, interesting waveforms. And you see these little square drops. Each of this is a sped up video. Oh, and then that long down bit. So those little square drops are the aphid probing individual cells in the mesophyll of the plant with its mouth part, just penetrating them and then releasing it. And then when it drops and goes continuously down like that, that's feeding from the phloem. And so we're able to measure all of these processes with this slightly absurd mechanism and get some data on how they do all of this. And this is the kind of picture that's built up there. So this is a magnified view model of what's happening. They have their mouth parts, they breast the rostrum, the stylets come out here, and they probe these cells on the way through, and then eventually reach the phloem. And what we found out is during these probing events, they're releasing saliva into the plant cells, and that saliva has got active ingredients, proteins that are immune suppressants. They're suppressing the plant immune response, because plants have an immune system, much like ours. They don't have blood cells and antibodies, but they have an innate immune system which can recognize attack. And in response to attack, they will produce toxins, chemicals that are toxic to pathogens and pests. They will change their gene expression. They'll start building up thicker cell walls and all of that. And the aphid doesn't want that. And everything about how the aphids feed is about stealth. They're moving stealthily through the cells without doing any damage, and just gently introducing these essentially anesthetics, you can think of them, so the plant doesn't perceive that it's under attack. And we can look at one way in which we're measuring this. I'll show you this little clip, but I'll show it again after I've explained what we're looking at. These are genetically engineered leaves of Arabidopsis plants, in which we put a fluorescent protein that only fluoresces, gives off light when the cells are signaling to say, I'm under attack. And part of what they do there, when a cell defense is activated, there's a big influx of calcium into the cell. And our fluorescent protein is only fluorescent when there's lots of calcium around. So when the aphid, which is running around on top, stops and probes, you see this little poof, and that's the cells emitting a distress signal going, we're under attack, but it's shut down again. And that video is sped up. It's over about 10 minutes in total. And we can look in contrast at what happens when a thrips feed. Thrips are small insects. You probably know them better as thunderbugs. They scrape away at the surface of leaves. And like, I only found out this is the singular, like sheep, the singular is the same as the plural. So you have some thrips or one thrips. Anyway, they scrape away at the surface and just ingest it. And they do a lot of damage when they're feeding. And you can see what happens to the plant when there's a thrips feeding on the plant. And it's lighting up like a Christmas tree, you know. And I think this really exemplifies how successful the aphids are at not being detected. So the plant is just thinking there's nothing going on here, there's no problem here, and the aphids are just getting on with their business. I'm going to show you that aphid video one more time, just so you can see that little poof. And then it's gone, and the plant is unaware that it's under attack. So aphids are, you may think of aphids as green fly and black fly, but there is a lot of diversity there. And in fact, there are about 5,000 different species of aphid globally. There are probably about 500 in the UK, and they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and colours, as you can see. And all sorts of different curious life history patterns, and some of them are waxy, like this one, I think. This is Iranian cabbage aphid. They produce bundles of waxy hairs out of their back. The reason for that I might touch on later, but you'll see, you might know the woolly apple aphid. If you have apple trees, you see these big fuzzy bundles of fluff, and that's wax that's produced by aphids. Some of them come in different colors, even within the same species. Some of them come in different colors. Really interestingly, it turns out that the red-colored aphids are red because they've got genes from a fungus that they acquired many millions of years ago that makes carotenoids. And somehow they transferred these genes from a fungus to start making these chemicals. And yes, green, black, and all sorts. And yellow, yeah, with black bits. I think that's the oleander aphid. And woolly, this is woolly apple aphid, I think. And woolly with wings, of course. You probably notice some aphids have wings, some don't. I'll get onto the life cycle and why that is. And some of them make galls, right? You've probably seen galls on your plants in various different guises. The robin's pincushion is a very famous one. That's not an aphid gall, that's a wasp gall. But as well as feeding from the plant and not eliciting a defense response, some of them cause the plants to develop in a way that suits the aphid, which includes building a case around the aphid so they can live inside this enclosed structures. And I think that's the witch hazel gall. And there's a cutaway gall where you can see the aphids living inside it. So they have direct access to the plant sap from inside their gall, but they're also protected from attack by predators and parasites, and given a nice home. And this is the poplar gall aphid, which produces these spiral-shaped galls on the leaf stems, the petioles of the black poplar. I think they're one of my favourites. And that's inside a poplar gall aphid. They're quite woolly, they produce wax. In the spring, when the leaves develop, one single aphid hatches out from an egg on the bark of the tree and flies onto the leaf stem and starts feeding, and the plant starts developing this gall around it, and then she starts giving birth, virgin birth, asexual reproduction, and creates an entire colony that are all her offspring within this gall. And some of them are soldiers, which is really interesting. You probably know about ants having this division of labor with different jobs, and they have workers and queens and soldiers and such like. Some of these gall aphids have soldiers as well. They're not very frightening things. They're very small, but they will see off competitors and other herbivores. So, as I said, 5,000 different species of aphid. They've evolved from a common ancestor about 130 million years ago, and yet they all look like greenfly or blackfly. Whereas if you look at what we evolved from 130 million years ago, it's probably something slightly reptilian, and then you imagine all of the diversity of mammals in that time, and yet aphids have this really successful strategy and body plan, and so they haven't changed much morphologically, but every plant on the planet, there's probably an aphid species that specializes on that plant, and that's my key to identifying aphids. I'm not an entomologist by training, and there are people out there who can look at an aphid, and especially generally by taking a close-up picture of its genitals, because that's what entomologists usually do, identify what species it is. But if you see what plant it comes from, when you find an aphid on a nettle, there's probably a 70% chance if you say it's a nettle aphid, you're probably going to be right. Yeah, so primates and elephants have 100 million years of evolution. I'm going to check that fact because I'm not quite sure that's right. But anyway, so, and I can get very boring on the subject of the toilet habits of aphids and other sapsuckers, because it's the root of some really important ecology. And as I said, the phloem sap that they feed from, this is where the sugars produced from photosynthesis are produced, and the phloem sap is absolutely full of sucrose, sugar. It's the sugar form sugar that we put in our tea. And in fact, there's far too much of it, far more than the aphids need. But they also have to get their other sources of nutrients. They need their nitrogen in the form of amino acids to make their protein. And there's lots of that in the phloem, just not very much in comparison to the amount of sugar. So in order to get enough nutrition, they have to ingest an enormous amount of sugar, and they have to excrete that as well. So what comes out of their rectum is a liquid excretion, poo, if you like, which is extremely sweet, and it's called honeydew. And that's why when you have an aphid infestation, it's very sticky and it attracts a lot of other animals because that's a really good source of nutrition for other animals. And that's the basis of a lot of ecosystems, really, because they bring ants to the table. And ants in particular, you may have seen some aphid colonies on your plants are absolutely swarming with ants. And that's because the ants like the sugar. But the relationship goes deeper than that because the ants really value this as a food source. And they actually farm the aphids. They tend them like a herd of cattle because they're really valuable to them. They will fight off predators. If there's a wasp who comes who thinks they're going to eat the aphids, the ants will fight them off. So the aphids are getting protection in return for providing food to the ants. Bees will feed from aphid honeydew, especially in the absence of flowers. And in fact, there are types of honey. If you've ever come across black forest honey, or it's also sometimes called honeydew bee honey. This is honey that's made in the absence of flowers when they're usually in a forest, and the bees will go and collect honeydew. So this is aphid food which has been eaten and then regurgitated by bees, and it's delicious. It's got quite a malty flavour, that one. And also the balance, I talked about the sugar and the amino acids. The balance of amino acids in plant sap isn't really quite right for animals. And you might know this if you're vegetarian, it's not necessarily straightforward to get the right balance of amino acids in your diet because, well, plants can make all 20 different amino acids. We can only make about 15 of them, I think. We have to get the others from our diet. And the phloem sap doesn't have the right balance. But aphids have got help in that from some bacteria, which are symbiotic, and these are called Buchnera, the aphid symbiotic bacteria, and they possess the capability to make those 5 amino acids, so they can take the ones that are present in the plant sap and make the missing ones. And they actually live inside aphid cells, so they're not just floating around in the gut. They're actually encased in a membrane, inside a structure, inside the aphid cells. Inside specific organs, and they're transmitted from mother to daughter. And this has been the arrangement since the common ancestors of aphids. So it's a very, very tight symbiosis. These bacteria can't be cultured outside the aphids. They become absolutely dependent on each other, and it's a lovely relationship. And as I mentioned, the big problem with aphid is viruses. They transmit plant viruses. There are a lot of these viruses that are really damaging to crops. This is what the structure of, I think this is barley yellow dwarf virus, and the symptoms of that in wheat plants is something like this. A lot of plant viruses have yellows or yellow in the names because they impede the ability of the plants to do photosynthesis. This is turnip yellow virus, which infects all sorts of brassica plants, and this is P. innation mosaic virus, all transmitted by aphids. And the way we control them is by spraying crops with insecticides, which isn't great, and it's usually because of the viruses, not the insects, that are the problem. Anyway, I shan't go on to that. I'll go on to aphid reproduction. As I said, they give birth to live young, usually asexually. They give birth to clones of themselves, so they're genetically identical. And this means they don't need to have sex. They can be born pregnant, and they are. And they're born pregnant with aphids that are pregnant, with aphids that are pregnant, with aphids that are pregnant. And so this is called telescoping of generations. And it means they can reproduce when conditions are right, incredibly fast. And that's why you see when the weather warms up in the spring and conditions are right, suddenly these colonies appear as if out of nowhere. And that's because there was one aphid there one day, and then a couple of weeks later, there's several thousand, and they're all clones. They're all genetically identical. And you might see a colony like this with one mother and all of their young. And I know that some of our green peach aphids, they can, each mother can give birth to 3 or 4 aphids in a day. And each of those is ready to give birth after a week. And you do the maths, but the exponential growth explains itself, and big colonies like that. But it's not all about asexual reproduction. If you know anything about evolution, it does love sex, and it plays a really valuable role in maintaining diversity in a population. And if everything is genetically identical and a disease comes along, then you're stuffed because the whole population is going to get wiped out. And so having sex and having diversity is really important for that stability. And the aphids do the best of both worlds. And typically this happens when the seasons change, when the nights draw in, they cuddle up. But those environmental signals give rise to the production of sexual aphids. So you have this summer cycle where they're just giving birth, giving birth, giving birth, giving birth, and then something triggers a change, and they produce sexual females and sexual males. And I took this picture, I'm very proud of this. In the green peach aphid, the sexual males have wings, and this is the sexual female. They lay eggs, they shuffle their genes, they achieve diversity, and then the eggs overwinter, and then in the spring they hatch and they get back on this cycle. We also have some embellishments to this basic path. For example, summer migrants, you have asexual females who grow wings, usually when the populations have expanded and they're all feeling a bit pushed in and they're running out of food. Some of the offspring will grow wings. They're still genetically identical, they're still clones. And yet somehow they've got this inbuilt ability, plasticity we call it, they can develop through different programs. And then these can spread and set up new colonies elsewhere where the conditions are still right. And these are an example of, another embellishment to this life cycle. These are soldier aphids I was talking about, attacking a competitor, in fact, a predator, I think here, and defending their colony from them. And as well as being pests on crops and having interesting life cycles, they are a really fundamental part of a lot of ecosystems. Because the aphids can tap into this food source in plants that a lot of other insects can't, they are providing nutrition for entire ecosystems. And they've got some, you probably know that ladybirds are predators of aphids and gardeners' friends because they'll keep your aphids down, but also lacewing larvae, they're absolutely voracious. That's the adult lacewing. I think this is a wasp larvae, and hoverflies as well. These are all predators, and they all prey on aphids. And oh, hello. Yes, I've got a video I'm going to show you. This one's on YouTube, so I'm hoping the internet connection is going to hold up. This is a video about some of the other enemies of aphids, which are the parasitoid wasps. I've got the spinning wheel of death here. Yeah, this isn't good. Well, I'll tell you about it. While they're waiting, there are an awful lot of micro wasp species that lay their eggs inside living hosts, and aphids are a favorite prey of theirs. And they've got this, what this video shows is the incredible darts. They've got this ovipositor at their back end, and they kind of approach an aphid and stick it in between their back legs from underneath and inject their eggs into that aphid. And then the eggs hatch and the developing larvae. I'm going to try and close this. Oh dear. And then the developed adult wasp bursts out of the live aphid and carries on its life cycle, and the aphid dies. I'm going to suggest, because we're sort of at that time, we pause for a break, and I'll try and make the computer work. So thank you for your attention so far.